Okay. Hi, Heather. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show. It's nice to have you here.
Oh, it was very nice to be invited. Thank you so much, Douglas.
So, you got a book out, and this is about Viking women.
Correct. Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, to be honest, I have not had that many people on talking about Vikings altogether, but I think you're the first one to talk about Viking women. So, and the book is called The Northwoman, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Why did you decide to write about this particular topic?
Well, I thought I would write a book about this topic because most people tend to think of the Vikings as these big, brawny, bearded men, battle axe slung over their shoulder, swords at their hips, kind of thing. And most people kind of see the Viking world as steeped in testosterone. And I know I certainly did. But several years ago, I ended up in Oslo and went to the Viking Ship Museum. And there, the star attraction was a ship from a very lavish Viking burial. As some of your listeners may know, the Vikings did bury some of their very important dead people in ships. And this was the case with the ship in the Viking Ship Museum. It came from a farmer's field near Oseberg in Norway, and it contained all kinds of treasures. It was buried under a big earthen mound. It contained all kinds of treasures, tapestries, ceremonial carts, very lavish clothing, fragments of them, I should say. And it also contained two human remains. Now, the farmers in the area had long called that earthen mound the King's Mound, or indicating that it was likely the burial place of a king or a very wealthy male lord. But when archaeologists excavated the ship in the uh, late 1800s, they found, to their amazement, they found human remains in the ship as well as all these lavish goods, and the human remains belonged to not men, not a man, but they belonged to two women. And this is the most lavish grave that is known to archaeologists in the Viking world. And I thought, holy smokes, women in this very lavish grave. Obviously, our picture of the Viking Age is missing a few pieces. So I decided to start doing research and start looking at Viking women.
What was their gender roles like back in those days? Because, I think one would assume that it was going to be very male dominated and, women were subservient, second class citizens, that type of thing. But from what I'm reading through on your bio, it seems like they weren't.
Well, yes, and it's very interesting that you mentioned this kind of typical gender role. These were the assumptions that many Scandinavians were laboring under, Scandinavian archaeologists, I should say, laboring under for a very long time. They simply assumed that the women were homemakers, mothers. If you think of a 1950s housewife, that's what they thought most Viking women were doing in Scandinavia at the time. However, as more women started entering the field of archaeology, certainly in the 1990s and onward, they started asking more questions about the roles that Viking women had played. Was this true? Were they all homemakers and wives? Um, and they started asking more questions. They started conducting more analyses of evidence from Viking burials. And lo and behold, they started uncovering evidence that suggested that Viking women played many different roles in Viking society. Now, I hasten to add that that Viking women, not all Viking women, were playing prominent roles in Viking society. Most women probably were homemakers and mothers, but some women definitely played major roles in the society.
Major roles such as what? In the
Well,
politics or the running of the villages? Or give me an example.
okay, well, certainly in politics, women were advisors. Women who were married to, let's say, kings, were acting as advisors, alliance builders. power brokers. They were actively involved in the planning of Viking raids and so on. It would appear, and more importantly, I mean, and this is something that really flabbergasted me. Viking women were making all the sailcloth for the sails on Viking ships. Now, the ships had these huge sails. Some of the sails were the size of 20 king-size beds that were pushed together. So if you can imagine that, that's the size of a Viking sail. And the sails were laboriously made by hand by women. And modern replication experiments have shown that to make just one of these huge sails would have taken about 10,000 hours of a woman's labor to make. So they were extremely labor intensive. And that's just one sail. Most seafarers didn't want to cross the Atlantic with just one sail. They wanted spare cloth for the sails. So, they might have two of these sails with them. So it was an enormous activity to be able to make and furnish sails for all the Viking fleets. These fleets sometimes numbered 100 ships and more. So women were actively involved in the preparations for the fleets.
So in the time period, this would have been 10th century, 11th century?
Well, the Viking Age began around 750 AD, and it lasted right into the late 1000s, and possibly even a little longer than that. It's still a bit controversial, but anyway, so yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to assume that they made it to Greenland and then on to Iceland, or the other way around. Which one comes first?
The other way, yeah. Iceland first, Greenland second.
Greenland second,
and
okay.
Then,
the reason that I bring that up is because remembering back to history that I was taught in high school and elementary school, very sparse on the Vikings. I mean, there was a little bit, and I'm wondering if that's just the American version, where I assume in Scandinavia they would learn a lot more about the Vikings, right?
Oh, I'm sure they did. And even here in Canada, we learn a lot more about them because the Vikings did make it to North America, and they actually established base camps in the province of Newfoundland. So we have archaeological evidence of these base camps. And one of them is at a site called Lance Omeros, and it contains about 3 or 4 very large Viking halls that were used to house people in the wintertime in Newfoundland. And we have evidence there of women who were with those very early expeditions to Newfoundland. Now, I'm talking about that site of Lance Meadows dates to 1021 AD. It's been very carefully dated. And that's, obviously more than 470 years before Christopher Columbus and his crew spotted land in the Americas. So it's a very early site. And even then, women were part of that expedition. And those expeditions would have been very tough because the Vikings, their boats were open. They didn't have, cabins that they could use to get in out of the weather. They were open, and they had no modern navigation systems. And the waters of the north, certainly Newfoundland, are very, quite difficult to navigate. So it would have been quite an arduous, harrowing journey. But nevertheless, women were part of those expeditions, and I found that fascinating.
Why did they come? The reason, let me preface that, because, we know why the Spanish came. They came to rape and pillage, and the English and the French and the Dutch were here as settlers. But, what were the Vikings doing? Were they coming to find new land to inhabit, or are they just exploring for the sake of map making?
No, the Vikings, it seems, were interested in scouting for resources. They were looking for valuable things in a country, in a land that hadn't been developed for resources. So they were looking for things like the ivory from a walrus's tusk. Ivory sold for very good prices in Europe, And so they were looking for, haulouts, the places where walruses went ashore, and they were looking for ivory. They were also looking for timber. Timber was very important to the Vikings, particularly those who were living on Greenland, where there were not a lot of trees. So they needed timber for their hulls, their great hulls, and many other purposes. Shipbuilding was an important consideration, and so they needed timber for their ships. So the Vikings were looking along the coast of North America, along the coast of Newfoundland, for valuable resources.
So is this book, how's it set up? Is it a historical fiction or is it more like a textbook?
No, it's definitely not a textbook. For each chapter, and each chapter explores a role that women played, such as women warriors. We have good evidence now that women actually were trained, some women were actually trained as warriors. So each chapter explores a different role that some Viking women played. And each chapter begins with a fictional passage. So in other words, I decided that I would write something fictional to bring to life some of the women whose remains were found in graves that I describe in the chapter, and so on. So I wrote a fictional passage to, draw readers into each chapter, and then provide the archaeological evidence and so on, and historical evidence that supports that. But the book is definitely not a textbook. It's written for the general public.
Where did you find all the information? Is it all online?
Yeah, a lot of the information was online, but I also interviewed Viking specialists, Viking archaeologists, Viking historians, and I spent 7 years doing the research. It was kind of a long haul, but many of the chapters are based on scientific papers. I'm a science writer. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a science writer. And I write for National Geographic and other magazines, and I tried to write it the book in that style and in that spirit. So the book is really intended for everyone.
Okay. Has the book been released?
Yes, it has been. So it's available at bookstores across the United States and near bookstores near the listeners of your show.
Okay. How is it being received?
I think it's being received really well. I got a really nice review in the Washington Post, and people, I've had a lot of very favorable response for it, including from the archaeologists. So, and that's really quite lovely. I'm very pleased.
Well, like I said at the beginning, it's not something that too many people have done interviews for or written books about. So it's kind of a new topic for a lot of people.
Well, I think so. I hope so. And my idea was, if we want to understand the Vikings, if we want to know who they actually were, we can't just focus on the men. We also have to think about what the women were doing at that time. And it's only by, getting looking at men and women that we get a complete picture of who the Vikings really were.
Well, again, the book is called The NORTHWOMEN, or
Yes.
Woman. Is it women or woman?
Plural.
Okay, women, plural.
Yes.
Okay, and it is available. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
Yeah, I do. My website is just at heatherpringle.com. Easy to find, and I have web pages there devoted to the book and to other articles I've written in the past. I've spent 40 years writing about archaeology, and the website kind of provides an introduction to some of the things I've done.
Well, thank you for coming on this show. This was very interesting, and best of luck with the book. Hope it does well.
Well, thank you so much, Douglas, and I really appreciate the invite to speak with you.